Why this lecture exists. Before birth, before identity, before memory. For most people living in the modern West, the story of a human life appears simple and self-evident. A child is born, life begins. Identity gradually forms through genetics, upbringing, education, and social conditioning. This framework is not wrong, but it is radically incomplete. This lecture was created to question a silent assumption that has dominated modern thought. The assumption that human consciousness begins at birth, and that everything meaningful about who we are can be explained solely by biology and environment. The purpose of this series is not to replace science with belief, nor to promote religious doctrine. Rather, it is to reopen a philosophical question that contemporary culture has quietly abandoned. What exactly is the subject that receives genetics, environment, and experience? And when did that subject first come into being? Over the past century, humanity has gained extraordinary explanatory power over the mechanics of life. We can map neural pathways, decode genomes, measure hormonal fluctuations, and predict behavioral tendencies with remarkable precision. Yet in doing so, we have increasingly avoided a deeper inquiry, the inquiry into consciousness itself. This lecture series exists at the boundary where disciplines rarely meet. It draws from philosophy of mind, Buddhist psychology, developmental psychology, and contemporary consciousness studies. At the center of this inquiry lies a provocative idea that birth may not be the beginning of consciousness, but rather a transition, a narrowing, a condensation of something that already existed. The Tibetan text known as the Bardo, Todol, often translated as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, does not treat death and birth as separate events. It describes them as continuous phases of a single process, a journey of consciousness undergoing transformation. This lecture does not ask the viewer to believe this teaching. It asks something more modest and more demanding, to consider whether ancient introspective traditions may have explored dimensions of consciousness that modern frameworks have not yet fully integrated. This content is created for several audiences. For thinkers who sense that standard explanations of personality and temperament feel incomplete. For individuals who carry emotional patterns they cannot trace to upbringing alone. For parents or future parents who wish to understand the prenatal environment, not merely as biological incubation, but as a formative psychological field. And for anyone religious or secular who suspects that the mystery of being human begins earlier than memory allows. With this context in mind, we now return to a deceptively simple question, the question that opens today's lecture. Main lecture reinterpreted and expanded. 1. English YouTube lecture format philosophical narrative. Is birth really the beginning? We often speak of birth as if it were an unquestionable starting line, a moment so obvious that it requires no philosophical reflection. A baby enters the world. Breath begins. Life, we say, starts there. But what if that certainty is an illusion created by memory? What if birth is not the origin of consciousness, but merely the point at which consciousness becomes visible to others, and eventually to itself? This question is not abstract speculation. It is foundational, because how we answer it determines how we understand identity, responsibility, suffering, and even freedom. If consciousness begins at birth, then everything prior is irrelevant. If consciousness precedes birth, then human life must be understood as a continuum, not an event. Western philosophy has wrestled with this tension for centuries. Plato spoke of anamnesis, knowledge, as remembrance. Descartes identified the certainty of awareness itself, but could not locate its origin. Modern neuroscience, for all its sophistication, still struggles to explain how subjective experience arises from matter at all. Into this unresolved space enters a different tradition, not as dogma, but as phenomenology. Tibetan Buddhist psychology does not ask when life begins. It asks how consciousness changes form. According to this framework, death is not annihilation, nor is birth creation. Both are transitions, radical shifts in the structure, scope, and limitation of awareness. Before birth, consciousness is described as expansive, fluid, unconstrained by physical boundaries. It perceives without organs. It moves without distance. It experiences without a body. Yet this openness is unstable. Consciousness, in its boundless state, cannot participate in a world of time, learning, and relationship. To live a human life, awareness must collapse into specificity. This is where birth enters the story, not as a beginning, but as a contraction. The Tibetan tradition calls the phase preceding conception the rebirth bardo. It is here that consciousness undergoes its final and most decisive transformation. What occurs in this phase is not a random descent into biology. It is a process of narrowing, selection, and compression. First, identity begins to crystallize. A consciousness that was once diffuse begins to orient itself around a center, not yet a name, not yet a body, but a direction, a sense of this life rather than infinite possibility. Second, attraction arises, not metaphorical attraction, but psychological and karmic resonance. Consciousness is drawn toward particular parents, particular emotional climates, particular relational dynamics. This attraction is not always pleasant. Some are drawn by familiarity, others by unresolved patterns, others by compassion, fear, or obligation. The emotional field of the parents matters deeply. Conflict, tenderness, anxiety, affection. These are not abstract moods. They are information. In this phase, consciousness is exquisitely sensitive. It registers emotional tone long before cognition exists. Third, sensory collapse occurs. Perception narrows. What was once boundless hearing becomes embryonic vibration. What was once luminous awareness becomes darkness, filled with rhythm, heartbeat, breath, blood. This compression is not gentle. Ancient texts describe it as overwhelming, even terrifying, like forcing an ocean through a straw. At this threshold, consciousness recognizes something unmistakable. I am about to forget, not permanently, but necessarily. To live as a human being requires amnesia. Total awareness would make survival impossible, and so consciousness consents, not because the coming life will be painless, but because it will be meaningful. Because within limitation, growth becomes possible. Within forgetting, discovery occurs. From this perspective, temperament is not accidental. Anxiety, sensitivity, resilience, aggression, curiosity, these are not simply byproducts of upbringing. They are compressed histories, not memories in narrative form, but tendencies, energetic signatures carried into embodiment. Modern psychology observes these traits. Ancient psychology attempts to explain their origin. Neither approach is sufficient alone. This lecture does not ask you to abandon science. It asks you to expand the timeline of inquiry, because the question that opened our discussion remains unanswered. If birth is not the beginning, then who were you before you had a body? And what did you bring with you into this life? From here, our exploration deepens. Birth as a double event, awakening and forgetting. At the moment of birth, two events occur simultaneously, and this simultaneity is the key to understanding human consciousness. One door closes, another door opens. The door that closes is memory. The door that opens is experience. And between those two movements, the human journey of learning begins again. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes birth with a phrase that sounds paradoxical to the modern ear. Birth is another form of awakening. At first glance, this appears poetic, even metaphorical. But when examined carefully through philosophy of mind, neuroscience, and developmental psychology, it becomes one of the most precise descriptions of what actually occurs at birth. In Tibetan Buddhist thought, Birth is not the beginning of existence. It is a transition, a movement of consciousness from one mode of being to another. More specifically, it is described as the reverse process of dying. Just as death involves the gradual dissolution of sensory structures, identity boundaries, and linear cognition, birth involves their sudden reconstruction, but in the opposite direction. To be born, in this view, is not simply to appear biologically. It is to reconfigure consciousness under a new set of laws. The closing of the memory gate. The great forgetting. The first event that occurs at birth is what Tibetan psychology calls the great forgetting. Up until the final moments before birth, consciousness, according to this framework, operates within a radically different architecture. Time is nonlinear. Perception is not divided into senses. Awareness is expansive, non-local, and largely non-individualized. But at birth, this entire mode of cognition becomes incompatible with the physical brain. As the nervous system takes over, these prior forms of awareness do not disappear through erasure. They are deactivated. This is a crucial distinction. Tibetan Buddhism does not claim that pre-birth awareness is destroyed. It claims that it is rendered inaccessible, sealed behind a structural boundary. This is what is meant by forgetting. From a neurological perspective, this idea is not as foreign as it might seem. At birth, the human brain undergoes one of the most extreme periods of neuroplasticity it will ever experience. Neural circuits rapidly reorganize to prioritize sensory processing, motor coordination, and survival responsiveness. Any form of non-sensory, non-symbolic, non-local memory simply has no place to be stored. Some consciousness researchers have described this as a systems-level incompatibility. Pre-birth awareness does not map onto neural architecture. Like data written in an unsupported format, it cannot be integrated, and so it is quarantined. This explains why most humans do not remember anything before early childhood, let alone before birth. Not because nothing existed, but because the storage system changed. The opening of the experience gate. Synchronization with the sensory world. At the same moment that memory closes, experience opens. Birth is the first time. Consciousness is forcibly synchronized with a fully sensory world. Before birth, awareness is not dependent on eyes, ears, or skin. After birth, it has no choice. The transition is abrupt and overwhelming. Vision shifts from complete darkness to fragmented light. Hearing transforms from internal rhythms, heartbeat, blood flow to external sound waves. Touch changes from fluid containment to gravity, air, and surface pressure. Even the nervous system itself is rewired in real time. Neural pathways reorganize to prioritize stimulus-response loops. Consciousness is now required to react. This moment marks the beginning of sensory-based learning. From this point forward, reality will be interpreted through data gathered by the body. In philosophical terms, this is the moment when non-material awareness binds itself to material conditions, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived constraint. The metamorphosis of consciousness. This transition is not adaptation. It is metamorphosis. One form of awareness becomes another. The most profound change occurs in what philosophers of mind call the observer position. Before birth, there is awareness, but no stable vantage point. Experience is diffuse, relational, and boundaryless. The fetus does not experience itself as separate from the environment. The mother's emotional state, nervous system, and physiology are not external influences. They are part of the same experiential field. There is no clear distinction between self and world. After birth, this changes rapidly. Sensory signals become individuated. Boundaries emerge. The external world begins to appear as something other. The observer moves from everywhere to somewhere. Philosopher Thomas Nagel famously defined consciousness as what it is, like to be something. Birth is the moment when that something becomes a specific someone. This is the origin of subjectivity as we know it. The reorganization of time. The second major transformation involves time. Before birth, experience does not unfold along a linear timeline. There is no before and after in the way adults understand it. Moments do not stack, they overlap. But after birth, the brain begins constructing time as a structure. The hippocampus initiates memory sequencing. The prefrontal cortex begins pattern prediction. The thalamus synchronizes sensory input. Past, present, and future emerge not as realities, but as cognitive frameworks. Time becomes something the mind produces, not something it merely inhabits. And this production begins at birth. The transformation of memory systems. The third shift occurs in how memory itself is stored. Before birth, memory is not narrative. It is not episodic. It exists as emotional residue, energetic imprint, somatic tendency. Buddhist psychology refers to this as alaya vijnana, a latent repository of impressions. After birth, memory becomes biological. Experiences are encoded in neural circuits. Emotions are regulated by the amygdala. Long-term memory is distributed across cortical networks. This is why questions about past life memory often miss the point. It is not that nothing was carried forward. It is that what was carried forward changed form. Temperament, sensitivity, fear responses, emotional intensity. These are not memories you recall. They are patterns you enact. Awakening and descent. The Tibetan Book of the Dead captures this paradox perfectly. Birth is another form of awakening and also a deep descent. Awakening into sensory reality. Descent into limitation. The lens of consciousness narrows. Infinite possibility condenses into a single life. This is not a loss. It is a requirement. Without forgetting, learning would be impossible. Without boundaries, identity could not form. Birth, then, is not merely the start of a life. It is the moment consciousness accepts a narrower field in exchange for depth. And that exchange, that voluntary contraction, is where the human story truly begins. The great paradox of birth. When vast consciousness enters a small body, today we turn directly toward the central paradox that lies at the heart of human existence. The paradox of birth. From a purely biological perspective, birth appears straightforward. A body separates from another body. Independent respiration begins. Life continues. But when examined from a professional and interdisciplinary perspective, through philosophy of mind, neuroscience, developmental psychology, and Buddhist psychology, birth reveals itself as one of the most radical transformations consciousness can undergo. The deepest paradox of birth is this: a vast, boundaryless consciousness enters a finite body. At the moment just before birth, fetal consciousness is not narrow or constrained. Neurologically speaking, the brain has not yet completed what researchers call self-integration. Sensory boundaries are incomplete. The neural circuits that later define self and other are still forming. The fetus exists in a state of near total physiological and emotional coupling with the mother. Her heartbeat, hormonal fluctuations, emotional rhythms, and autonomic nervous system activity are not external stimuli. They are part of a shared experiential field. Philosophically, this condition is known as boundaryless consciousness. In Buddhist psychology, it is described as a residual glow of primordial awareness, a faint continuation of original clarity that is not yet condensed into individuality. This is not mysticism. It is a description of a consciousness that has not yet been forced to locate itself inside a single point of reference. The moment of contraction. At birth, everything changes. In a single event, expansive awareness becomes bound to one physical body, one brain architecture, one nervous system, one sensory interface. This is the paradox. Just moments earlier, consciousness is not clearly separated from the world. Emotion, sensation, and energetic flow move freely across boundaries. Awareness is collective rather than private. It exists in a state of possibility, what philosophers call preform consciousness. Immediately after birth, that openness collapses into specificity. The body becomes a boundary. Sensation operates only within neuro limits. Self-centered orientation begins to emerge. Infinite potential gives way to a single lived trajectory. Philosophically speaking, this is the moment when infinite possibility converges into a specific history, an ontological shift from wholeness to individuation. From an ontological perspective, birth is not merely an event, it is a relocation of being. It is a movement from wholeness to individuation. Carl Jung described this process as consciousness, temporarily forgetting its primordial totality in order to form a persona, a coherent, functional identity capable of navigating the world. In this sense, birth is not separation alone. It is ontological reallocation. Consciousness does not disappear from the whole. It takes up residence in a specific position within it. The expansive nature of awareness is compressed into the experiential structure of a single person. This is why the Tibetan Book of the Dead can state, without contradiction, birth is awakening. Awakening does not always mean expansion. Sometimes it means precision. Birth is not a regression. It is a new mode of awareness under stricter conditions. A neuroscientific parallel from no boundary to boundary. Neuroscience mirrors this philosophical insight with striking accuracy. Before birth, the fetal brain lacks fully developed systems for distinguishing self from environment. The prefrontal cortex, central to identity and self-regulation, is immature. Sensory cortices have not fully differentiated. The hippocampus, responsible for organizing memory across time, is not yet operational in its adult form. As a result, fetal consciousness lacks sharp borders. After birth, the nervous system reorganizes rapidly. Sensory input becomes externalized. The autonomic nervous system begins independent regulation. The brain builds structures specifically designed to separate me from not me. This moment corresponds precisely with Buddhist descriptions of the arising of clear boundaries. Birth, then, is the simultaneous formation of neural boundaries and existential boundaries, from potentiality to decision. Before birth, consciousness exists primarily in a state of potentiality. Many futures overlap. Many lives are possible. Nothing is fixed. At birth, that field collapses. Consciousness commits to one body, one genetic profile, one family, one culture, one historical moment. Existential philosophy describes this as the collapse of possibility into concrete history. In physics, we might compare it to the collapse of a wave function, where probability becomes outcome. In human terms, birth is the moment consciousness says, "This life." That decision does not erase other possibilities. It renders them unrealized. This is why Tibetan tradition describes birth as awakening, because awakening is not seeing everything. It is recognizing oneself within necessity. The lens, not the prison. We often misunderstand birth as imprisonment. We imagine a great consciousness trapped inside a small body. But philosophy of mind and Buddhist psychology offer a different interpretation. Birth is not a prison. It is a lens. A lens narrows vision but increases depth. Through limitation, experience becomes meaningful. Through specificity, relationship becomes possible. Through finitude, learning acquires urgency. A vast consciousness, filtered through a single human life, gains something it could not access otherwise: depth. The final resolution of the paradox. The paradox of birth resolves itself when we understand this. By leaving wholeness, we gain understanding. By choosing one life, we generate meaning. By entering a small body, consciousness discovers depth. This is what the Tibetan Book of the Dead means when it says, birth is another awakening. Not the loss of awareness, but the beginning of a new kind of seeing. Birth is the most fundamental transformation consciousness undergoes. Not an ending, not a fall, but the opening of a precise, demanding, and deeply human way of knowing the world. What we have explored today is not a religious doctrine or a reincarnation tale. It is a philosophical inquiry into the most mysterious threshold of human experience. The journey of consciousness, the awareness of the fetus, the structure of the bardos, and the final transformation before birth. In the lectures that follow, we will continue to examine these questions with depth, rigor, and openness. If you wish to continue this exploration with us, please consider subscribing, liking this lecture, and enabling notifications so you do not miss future discussion. Thank you for listening. I look forward to continuing this journey with you in the next lecture.